Bon, évidemment, d'abord, mes propos n'engagent que moi-même.
Well, this is, of course, a personal viewpoint.
Donc,
And
commencer avec
I will start with
la première partie qui était la mission
the
des droits
first
de l'homme
part
au Rwanda.
regarding the mission for the human rights in Rwanda.
Donc, en 97,
In 1997, of course, we were shocked by the onslaught against the manpower, etc., including 5 people who died, 5 colleagues. And Gisenyi and Hungary were closed, and regardless of the atrocities, etc., and nobody was allowed to move without escorts, etc., so bodyguards. So what did we try to do? Because of my responsibility, normally I was a senior officer in charge of justice and investigation. So at the national level, I tried to investigate in the field of human rights, and we tried to get information about from the logistic profile and the procedures, etc. And then, of course, we had a lot to do because lawyers and magistrates had been killed. So, of course, we had a lot to do. And the people who remained were Tutsi people who came from the foreign countries. And they had no legal background. They didn't have any academic background. Some Hutu people were left, but we had a judge who said that he was informed at the end of 1997 not to provide statistics, and the prosecutor, the Gisenyi prosecutor, had disappeared, in addition to an APR officer. And of course, there was another problem. We depended upon other UN nations which were not involved in the human rights. So, of course, I will inform you about my personal background, my personal viewpoint. And first of all, the development agency, the UN program agencies, etc., are not involved in human rights. Other organizations, the Avocats Sans Frontières, Human Rights Watch, CICR, of course, they were involved, as you can see. Now, regarding the tensions, there was another problem. We had more than 126,000 prisoners in Rwanda. I tried to go to prison to see them, and they were happy because they were surviving. They were surviving, but of course they had to sleep one after the other because the prisons were overcrowded, and they had no legal assistance or whatever. And regarding their prisons, the prisons would shelter 20 people normally. You would have 200, 300 people being sheltered, housed in those small, shitty areas. And then some people would be released, and we suspect that some of them were, they were shot down. Sorry. And then, they were not really, they were shot down. Now, we tried, of course, to favor transparency, to inform detainees and prisoners about their rights, to draft a specific database, etc., regarding people who were in jail. Regarding the RPF, regarding investigations, they didn't like it because of the propaganda about the genocide, etc. And I was, of course, involved in that. The investigations for crimes committed by RPF were so evident, so obvious. And in 1997, there were more and more incidents that were increasing, I would say, and especially in Gisenyi and Hungary. 2,000 people were killed every month, for example, because of infiltrations from the north of Kivu, where Tutsi people were killed while traveling on the bus, etc. And because they had cooperated with the authorities, or maybe because the RPA believed that Hutus were a target, the right target. So, at the end of the day, these are the difficulties. It was not easy for me to work under those conditions because we had to collect information in Kigali, and we had to meet with people that we were tapped and followed, etc. And only 4 people were working upon that in order to cover 99% of the crimes committed, etc. And then we had a very limited access to Gisindi and Rengarin. But having said that, we collected information, and of course, to the detriment of the government. It is the reason why sometimes we had in 1998 we invented a new rebellion in Congo to justify another invasion. But at the beginning, we denied the presence of the foreign troops. You can see here, this is the entrance of the caves, Nyakinama caves. There is an assessment of 5,000 to 10,000 victims killed by the RPA. This is another picture of the refugee camps of refugees. The second mass killing that was held in December. 326 people were killed. And this is the kind of problem we had. This is a colonel came over. Now he lives abroad. He was accused of several crimes, especially regarding the Rwanda briefing with Patrick Karegeya, who was assassinated, murdered in Kigali. You can see the US ambassador, the military attaché, David Sheffer, who was the ambassador for war crimes for Bill Clinton. And can you see here what happened before the genocide? During a visit in the RPF area, they spent 2 or 3 hours with the RPA, and they said that they were not sufficiently convinced about regarding the investigation. They said, okay, we can move on. This is what they said.
Here we have somebody who really opened my eyes, the legendary Rose Carr, who had a farm in the northwest in her family for 50 or 60 years. That's an orphanage that she set up for Tutsi and Hutu orphans. She told me about a number of crimes she witnessed, and she explained to me what had happened. Now let's go on to Congo. We talked earlier on about the mission where there were the most peacekeepers in the world. That is true, yes, but Congo is as big as Western Europe, more or less. So as far as numbers of peacekeepers per head of population are concerned, it is one of the missions where the fewest UN peacekeepers, and we're not even talking about the capabilities of the peacekeepers on the ground. 4 million deaths in the Congo, and that is since the second invasion. That doesn't include the Hutus and the Congolese killed during the first invasion. In 2006, there were probably at least 5 million people killed, but despite that, there was very little coverage in the media. Now, when I arrived, we tried to repatriate FDLR people. We saw the propaganda of the RPF, of the government, which said that there were about 85,000 foreign fighters in Congo. Was ridiculous. There was probably 10 to 17,000. If there had been 85,000, they would have invaded the whole of Congo. We carried out several visits in 2001 without many. They weren't really productive. The foreign fighters had really no intention of leaving, but several cadres were delivered to Rwanda by force by the Congolese government. And there were battles in Kamina at the end of November, the beginning of December. And Colonel Nanda, who was their leader, was killed. A number of them fled, and several hundreds were repatriated in a voluntary, quote-unquote, manner. They didn't really have the choice, but they agreed to go back home with their families. But that did give us the first overview, because we noted that for most of those people, if they were not accused of genocide, it was just as well for them to shut their mouths and go back to Rwanda, where they could live under fairly correct conditions at that time, if they kept their mouths shut. At that time of inter-Congolese dialogue in 2002, there was very little access for the mission in the ether. Very few peacekeepers. Rwanda didn't want to give us access. Following protests, we added 6 Mai Mai delegates. One of my tasks was to find real representatives of the Mai Mai to take part in negotiations. And it was difficult because the Mai Mai setup was a bit complicated. There was a lack of access. It was difficult to meet most of the chiefs. We, however, did find people before trying to find out who was their real representatives. We did find people, and we managed with some difficulty to bring them to Sun City. However, Rwanda tried there again to call upon their own delegates, so they brought alleged Mai Mai, and notably people who ended up becoming undersecretaries at the UN. But we did manage to have a signature, to have a signing of the general agreement. And then for about a year, there were difficulties, but things started to get better. And that is important for future missions. There was a sort of honeymoon following the first peace agreement. People are happy. Usually there's some goodwill. People are ready to cooperate. At that time, we started to bring him a number of volunteers, notably Hutu Mai Mais, that is Rwandans and Burundis, who were with the Mai Mai groups, and also deserters from the FDLR. The 15th of December 2002, the first really voluntary repatriation of Hutu fighters. We were still arrested, kept prisoners for about 3 hours by a militia which was close to Rwanda, who didn't want us to go back home. But the process did start. Another complication is that there was a third-party verification mission with South Africa and the UN, where we tried to bypass the UN so that we didn't know who actually went back to Rwanda, and other commissions, and it was extra burden on the peacekeeping operation. There was another question, which was the problem of the winners and losers with Colonel Dunia. And there were people who lost leadership positions, who were transferred, for example, and the whole lifestyle. We mentioned the profits of the war, at least at the lowest level, that people were going to lose. And the repatriation of foreign fighters was linked to the stability in the Congo, and that was important. We needed disarmament, resetting up of the Congolese army, but control was virtually non-existent. Some groups had 2 or 3 more combatants on their list, and was really the case. A number of foreign fighters, the presence of foreign armies, a proxy war that continued, notably in the DRC, Congolese factions that fought against one another, and very ineffective Congolese forces that weren't able to defend the country against foreign occupiers or confront foreign rebels. And also the population being ransomed. So at one stage, they accuse us of stopping the nice militiamen from defending them, and then on the other hand, we're accused of not stopping the militiamen ransoming them. And when the transition government was appointed, we no longer had a neutrality obligation. We could give real support to the government, and we tried to do what we could to help with discipline. I help him to bring a helicopter to pay the troops, for example. If you want disciplined troops, you need to pay them first of all. And when they are paid, then you can bring discipline to them. And once they are disciplined, then they can be of some use. That's Colonel Amani, whom we convinced to come home. Unfortunately for him, he didn't keep his mouth shut, and a few months after getting back to Rwanda, he was imprisoned. I don't know if he ever came out of prison. Then demobilization of child soldiers. Then the economic aspects of the Rwandan occupation. That comes from the Harvard Africa Policy Journal, an article I wrote for them. You see that the development aid supported by the by the international community goes far beyond the budget for the official defense budget. So they had money from abroad, and they were able to finance their wars, finance armed forces in Congo. And with all the pillaging and aid, Rwanda seems to be well placed. You do a good job with all the money you're given, so we'll give you even more money. Same thing for Uganda. And here we see the presence of armed forces in the areas where there are mines. And then we have Operation Makusudi. That's something we discovered. It's aimed at stopping any progress occurring in Congo. There was no overall agreement. We wonder why that agreement didn't actually pan out. But there's always difficulties after the signing of a peace agreement to build a country. There are always spoilers, as we say in English, people who wanted to stop things working well. So every time there was progress achieved, Uganda and Rwanda tried to hinder that progress that was accomplished. So the first thing they did was a vast offensive against the Mai Mai to try to lay their hands on as much land as possible. That stopped us from bringing back Hutu fighters to Rwanda, because the Mai Mai said, well, you're depriving us of our best elements, so we're going to stop cooperating with you, Monarch. The Mai Mai chiefs were sent to Kinshasa for training, were without support in a big city that they didn't know, and they felt that it was better to go back to their 14 wives and 300 cows rather than surviving here poorly in Kinshasa. The Rwandese government also tried to reinforce militias that had not signed the peace agreement, such as Mudundu 40, or invent or set up new militias. At one stage, I had somebody from Mudundu 40 who was a governor, and he said, well, we are from Mudundu 40, we didn't sign the overall peace agreement, so we don't need to abide by it. And there was infighting between the different militias in Bukavu. We were not ready to disarm the M40. We already referred to Banyamulenge officers who had been instrumentalized by the RPA and who'd committed a number of crimes in Congo, and they'd been placed in major positions before the transition. And also the Friends of Masuso, in inverted commas, that is Kabila comrades, who were assassinated in obscure circumstances, and they were promoted to key positions also. So then there was that whole entourage of war criminals and people who were pro-RPF. And there was a governor who was condemned in absentia for the assassination of Laurent Désiré Kabila. And we could see those people go to Kigali to seek instructions. So sometimes we went to meetings in Kigali, and we would meet them and say, well, how come you're here? Do you have permission to travel? Well, during a meeting of the TPVM in Kigali in 2003, the delegation of the Congolese government says, whatever is Thomas Lubanga doing in the same hotel as us in Kigali? And the co-chair of the meeting, the South African, said, oh, it's not important. However, sometime later, there was an explosion of violence in Ituri province. Lubanga was at the head of that violence. He was aided and abetted by Bosco Ntaganda, at the head of another militia, M23. And this I presented to the Security Council when they visited Bukavu. And here we see that every time there is any progress in South Kivu, when we start sending home fighters to Rwanda, every time Rwanda and its allies, its militias in Congo, did something to bring us back to square one, to complicate the situation. Although they say, well, why aren't you doing more? Why don't you repatriate more people? Whereas they hadn't brought home any single combatant. So we have that third revolt. There's the expansionist tendencies within Rwanda, and then we discovered several arms caches in South Kivu, especially in Bukavu. Chilibanya, the government was suspended, and the second in command in the region tries to kill the head, the military head of the region. And then we're told there's a genocide which is being perpetrated against the Tutsis. And I have interpreters who were placed to monitor radio stations because we discovered the opposite. Although there was criticism against Rwanda for its actions, the real hatred came from Radio Rwanda because they were sending constant messages saying there's a genocide against you, people hate you, they're killing you. And Hutus and Tutsis were given that message. So the solidarity of Rwandan speakers against all the other Congolese, and unfortunately, silence from MONUC and the international community. Motsobuti is suspended, but his militia continues. We have a new commander, and war in Bukavu, Laurent Kunda, who doesn't have a position in North Kivu because he doesn't want one, but he arrives suddenly with several thousand very well-armed fighters. We protected civilians as best we could, and it was just a threat of an intervention force of the European Union, just as in Ituri, meant that all at once Nkunda decided that there hadn't been a genocide after all, so I'll withdraw my 3,000 troops, which continued to complicate the situation in northern Kivu. The lack of action meant that there were attacks on other UN sites, pillaging, distrust, generally a weakening of military forces of the transition government, and also a massacre of Congolese Tutsis in the Gatumba camp. What was peculiar is that I went the day before to discuss with the authorities the sake of Burundi's fighters that were being massed in another camp. Nobody wanted them. And I was handed over a letter which mentioned that Colonel Dunia is linked with the NLF, etc. Well, I didn't take it too seriously at that time. I had other things on my mind. Then on the following day, I go back to Bukavu. For the first time, the border post in Bugarama is closed. Not for everybody, just for me, just for the UN mission. And then we learn that in the night, that massacre has been committed. The Rwandese government was the first to warn us. The army, the police force had done nothing to stop the massacre. And when we went on the spot to investigate, we said, well, that's a letter we handed over to you. But there was another first name for Colonel Dunia. They mentioned district rather than territory. There were 5 or 10 mistakes in the letter which showed that it was a forgery, an invention. And I sent my guys to investigate on the border to confirm what I suspected, i.e. it was just not believable that the Mai who had never attacked Burundi or Rwanda organized themselves to attack a refugee camp suddenly against the Burundian armed forces without being seen, without being heard. That was totally disbelievable, even if the NLF asked for them to be prosecuted. We did not fall for that propaganda. Then we have the Rome process, which maybe nobody remembers, but there was a serious effort to set up a dialogue between the FDLR and the Rwandan government. We even had the visit of Ignatius Mowan-Shiaka, the president of the FDLR, but the Rwandans were not interested. But we understood that they wanted a number of people in Congo that they would call genocide perpetrators, although in fact there had been small children at the time of the genocide, and they hadn't invaded Rwanda for a long time. That was a pretext to maintain their presence in Congo. However, we did manage to repatriate most foreign fighters. Here you see there are fewer and fewer of them, and up to 2007. As I said earlier, we have to reform the security sector if we want to get rid of the militias and especially foreign fighters. And we need to do practical things such as registration, support of donors. That was really complicated. There was a lack of aid. That's the plain of Luvungi, but there was no bases. So the fighters arrived there, but they had no roof over their heads, so they started pillaging the population. The problem was that the donors and the monarch were 2,000 kilometers away in Kinshasa, so they had no feeling for the urgency of the situation. Right, let's draw a few conclusions. If you don't have security, it's really difficult to make progress on any other topic. You need an overall approach. We had a limited period of time to lay the bases. We need quick answers, a quick response. The decision makers must be fairly close to the ground. We need at least 10 years to build something, put something in place after a conflict. And as we said earlier on, the more difficult it is, the longer a conflict is, the longer it takes. Don't go through the UNDP or the World Bank to reform the security sector. They're too long, they're too incompetent. Their tendency is to bow their head before dictators. Rapid reaction force. France was very useful from time to time, even though most of the contingents are only there for the money. If we have one or two troops are really operational, it can really help. If we don't put in the resources at the outset, we pay more later on. And we need to put an end to the justice of the winner. I was shocked to see that some people are recycled in government forces despite the war crimes. We have the firemen who set fire, such as Kagame. We must must put an end to fating them, financing bloodthirsty regimes. And you see what happens to a war criminal fated by everybody. Thank you very much.